wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the choice I didn't know I'd have to make. Could I salvage the life I'd spent years building with my husband, or would one forbidden connection tear everything apart? What happens when the person you've been waiting for your whole life arrives at the worst possible time? Stick around to find out how one moment of passion set off a chain of events I'll never forget. And before we dive into this tangled web of love and betrayal, make sure you subscribe for more gripping stories just like this one. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts as this unfolds. He came inside my body. The title says it all, doesn't it? But let me tell you, nothing could have prepared me for the whirlwind that followed the moment David stepped into my life. It started with a simple knock on the door, one I almost ignored. I was in the middle of loading the dishwasher, Mark's half-empty coffee mug still sitting on the counter like a silent reminder of his absence. He was always away. His work conferences, his endless meetings, his frequent late nights. Sometimes I wondered if he even noticed the growing void between us, or if he cared at all. When I opened the door, there he stood, David, the handyman we'd hired for the home renovation. He carried himself with an easy confidence, his dark hair falling slightly into his eyes as he adjusted the toolbox on his shoulder. His smile was disarming, warm yet teasing, as though he could read every thought running through my head. "Mrs. Cotter," he greeted, his voice smooth, his tone playful, ready to see some magic happen. I laughed lightly, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "I don't know about magic, but I'm hoping for less chaos in my kitchen." He stepped inside, brushing past me, and the faint scent of cedar wood and fresh air followed him. I watched him set his things down, his movements deliberate yet unhurried. There was something about David that made the air around him feel heavier, more charged. Over the next few hours, I tried to distract myself with tasks that needed doing, folding laundry, tidying up the living room, but my thoughts kept wandering back to him. Every time he moved, every time his shirt lifted just slightly to reveal a glimpse of his toned back, I found myself pausing, staring longer than I should. "You're quiet today," he said, breaking the silence as he worked on installing the new cabinet handles. His eyes flicked to me, catching me mid-gaze. "Any moment now," I whispered. "Oh," I stammered, heat rising to my cheeks. "Just thinking. It's been a busy week." He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. You sure? It's not me distracting you." I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "You wish." But his smirk lingered, his eyes holding mine a little too long before he turned back to his work. My heart raced as I quickly busied myself with something, anything, to avoid the growing tension in the room. Later that evening, after David had packed up and was about to leave, he hesitated at the door. "You know," he started, his tone softer now, "if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm a pretty good listener." I blinked, surprised. "Talk about what?" He shrugged, his gaze steady. "Anything. Life, marriage, work. I'm around if you need it." For a moment I wanted to brush him off, to laugh it away, but something in his eyes, something sincere, stopped me. I gripped his shoulder and his hand as we made our way to the boardwalk. "Thanks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I might take you up on that." As he walked down the path and disappeared into his truck, I leaned against the door, my heart pounding. What was happening to me? Why did he make me feel this way? Like a woman again, like someone who mattered. The next day, I found myself lingering in the kitchen as David worked, asking him questions I didn't really care about just to keep him talking. He told me about his hometown, about how he'd fallen into construction work after dropping out of college. He had an easy way of sharing pieces of himself, making me feel like I wasn't just some client he barely knew. And then it happened. I'd been filling glasses of water for us when I accidentally tipped one over, spilling it all across the counter. "Oh no!" I exclaimed, grabbing a towel to clean up the mess. And then, before I could start, David was beside me, his hand brushing mine as he reached for the towel. The contact was electric, sending a jolt through me that made me freeze. "It's just water," he said, his voice low, his smile teasing. But his hand lingered for a moment too long, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. I swallowed hard, stepping back. "I've got it," I mumbled, my voice unsteady. "Of course," he said, his tone unreadable. But as he stepped away, the ghost of his touch still lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted. The following week, Mark called to tell me he'd be extending his trip. Something came up, he said, his tone flat, almost dismissive. "Right," I replied, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Of course. When are you coming home?" "Not sure yet," he said vaguely. "Don't wait up." As the line went dead, I stared at my phone, anger and loneliness bubbling to the surface. How had we gotten here? To this place where we barely spoke, where I was more of a roommate than a wife. I felt like I was drowning, and Mark didn't even notice. That evening, David came by to finish the last touches on the cabinets. He found me in the living room, curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. "Rough day?" he asked, setting his tools down. I sighed, forcing a smile. "Something like that." He hesitated, then sat down on the edge of the couch, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to pretend with me. You know." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I'm not pretending," I said defensively, but my voice wavered. He tilted his head, studying me. "Maybe not, but I think you're carrying more than you let on." For a moment I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't know me, didn't understand what I was going through. But instead, I broke. The words spilled out of me. How Mark and I had grown apart. How I felt invisible. How I didn't even recognize myself anymore. David listened quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finally finished, he reached out, his hand gently covering mine. "You deserve more than that," he said softly, his voice filled with conviction. Tears filled my eyes, and I quickly looked away, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," I said, pulling my hand back. "You didn't come here to hear me vent." He smiled. "I don't mind," he said, his tone so sincere it made my chest ache. "If it helps, I'm here." I nodded, unable to speak. As he stood to leave, he paused, his hand brushing my shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Laura. You're worth it." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with a heart that felt heavier and lighter all at once. As Laura struggles with the emotions David stirs in her, the line between professional courtesy and forbidden intimacy begins to blur. What happens when a spark ignites a flame neither of them can control? The next morning, I found myself lingering at the window, watching David's truck pull into the driveway. It was becoming a pattern, a ridiculous, shameful pattern. My heart raced at the sound of his truck door slamming. my stomach fluttering as his boots crunched over the gravel. I'd spent far too much time that morning getting ready, even though I had nowhere to go. My hair was freshly curled, my lips glossed, and I'd slipped into jeans that hugged me a little too well. What was I doing? I didn't have long to answer the question. A firm knock at the door snapped me out of my thoughts, and when I opened it, there he was, David, as effortlessly confident as always. Today, he wore a navy blue t-shirt that stretched perfectly over his chest, and his usual easy smile was in place. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," he said, his eyes twinkling with something unspoken. "Laura," I corrected, a little too quickly. "You can call me Laura." His smile deepened, and he nodded. "Laura it is." The way he said my name, low, deliberate, sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped aside to let him in, my pulse quickening as he brushed past me. His presence was magnetic, and I couldn't stop myself from stealing glances at him as he set down his tools and began to work. The hours passed in a blur. I made coffee, offering him a cup as an excuse to sit nearby and watch him. We chatted about little things, his favorite movies, my abandoned dream of becoming a painter. And for the first time he said, "Continue." ChatGPT said, away distractedly like Mark often did, or cut me off mid-sentence to check his phone. David listened. His attention was unwavering, and every word he said felt purposeful, as if he was piecing together the puzzle of who I really was. As the afternoon light softened and stretched through the kitchen, David leaned against the counter, wiping his hands with a rag. "So, this is the last project for the cabinets. Once it's done, my work here's all wrapped up," he said, his tone casual but his eyes searching. "Stay." My heart sank at the thought of him leaving. I masked the disappointment with a smile. "Well, everything looks great. Mark will be happy to have the kitchen back in one piece." David studied me for a moment, his smile fading slightly. "What about you? Are you happy?" His hands gripped my shoulders. The question caught me off guard and I faltered, glancing away. "That's a loaded question," I said with a nervous laugh. But the vulnerability in his gaze made it impossible to deflect. "I'm serious," he pressed, his voice lower now, softer. "You've been putting on this brave face, but I can see through it." My lips parted, words forming but refusing to come out. Instead, my silence filled the space between us, heavy and charged. David took a cautious step closer, his expression unreadable. "Laura," he murmured, his voice a warm whisper that felt like a blanket around my trembling heart. "You don't have to say it if you don't want to. That you don't deserve to feel like this." It was too much. The dam broke, and before I knew it, tears spilled over my lashes. I turned away, embarrassed by the outburst. But David was there, his hand gentle on my shoulder. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady and soothing. "You don't have to apologize." You called this memory. I wiped my cheeks, forcing a shaky laugh. "This is ridiculous. You're here to fix cabinets, not deal with my mess." "I don't mind the mess," he said, his tone rich with meaning. "Sometimes it's the mess that makes things real." End quote. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David packed up his tools. The day had been an emotional whirlwind, but as he stood in the doorway to leave, the tension between us felt heavier than ever. "I'll see you tomorrow, then?" he asked, his hand lingering on the doorframe. I hesitated, unsure of what I was even agreeing to. "Tomorrow." He nodded, his lips curving into a soft smile before he stepped outside. I closed the door behind him, leaning against it as my chest heaved with the weight of unspoken words. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Mark had texted earlier, a generic working late, don't wait up message that left me feeling emptier than before. My mind drifted back to David, the warmth in his voice, the way his eyes lingered on me just a moment too long. I hadn't felt this alive in years, and yet the shame coiled tightly in my stomach, a constant reminder of the line I was dangerously close to crossing. The next day, David arrived as promised. This time I felt different, less guarded, more open to the pull that had been building between us. As he worked on the final touches of the cabinets, I sat at the table with a cup of tea, watching him with a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. "You know," he said, glancing over his shoulder, "I think I'll miss this place when I'm done." "Really?" I asked, surprised. He nodded, turning to face me fully. "It's not the house," he admitted. "It's you." The air between us crackled, and I felt my cheeks flush. "David?" He stepped closer, his movements deliberate but not rushed. "I'm sorry," he said, though his voice held no regret. "I know I shouldn't say things like that." I shook my head, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "No, it's okay." He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze searching mine. For a moment, I was frozen, caught between the weight of my marriage and the undeniable connection I felt with him. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped closer. "It is," I whispered, my voice barely audible. His breath hitched, and the intensity in his eyes deepened. He reached out slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, but I didn't. His hand brushed my cheek, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. "I've thought about this," he murmured, his thumb tracing my jawline. "About you." I didn't respond with words. Instead, I leaned into him, closing the gap between us. His lips met mine, soft and hesitant at first, but the hesitation quickly gave way to something raw, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. My fingers tangled in his hair, and for the first time in years, I felt desired, needed. The world outside faded, leaving only the warmth of his touch and the fire igniting between us. When we finally pulled away, breathless and flushed, I couldn't bring myself to look at him. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, and guilt crept in like a shadow. "Laura," he said softly, tilting my chin up so our eyes met. "Don't do that. Don't regret this." "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice trembling. "This isn't me." His eyes were dark and serious. "Maybe it should be," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe you deserve to be happy." Never before had she felt this certain of her love. His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. I didn't have an answer, but as he held me close, I couldn't help but wonder if he was right. As Laura and David grapple with the aftermath of their kiss, the boundary between right and wrong becomes increasingly blurred. What happens when temptation proves too powerful to resist? Will Laura choose to follow her heart, or will the weight of her choices bring everything crashing down? The morning after that kiss, I awoke with a knot in my stomach. The memories of David's lips on mine were still fresh, vivid in a way that made my skin tingle and my chest tighten. My reflection in the mirror told a story I wasn't ready to face. Flushed cheeks, restless eyes, and the unmistakable glow of a woman who had tasted something forbidden. I sighed deep. Mark had called late last night, his voice distant as usual. "Don't forget to send me the photos of the finished kitchen," he'd said, as though that was the only thing that mattered. He hadn't even asked how I was doing, whether I missed him, or even if I'd slept well. It was a transactional conversation, one that left me cold and hollow. I stared at the empty bed beside me and wondered how long I'd been lying to myself, how long I'd been pretending that Mark's indifference wasn't slowly breaking me. And now, David was here, throwing gasoline on the fire of everything I'd tried so hard to suppress. When David arrived later that day, I tried to keep my distance, but it was impossible. The way he moved around the kitchen, the way he smiled when he caught me watching him, it was like gravity, pulling me toward him, whether I wanted it or not. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and slightly teasing as he set his tools down. His gaze lingered on me for just a moment too long, and I felt my resolve weaken. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. My voice trembled, betraying the storm brewing inside me. David noticed. "You okay?" he asked, stepping closer. "You seem different today." I swallowed hard, averting my eyes. "I'm fine." But I wasn't, and I think he knew it. As the day wore on, the tension between us grew unbearable. Every glance, every accidental brush of his hand against mine felt electric, igniting something in me I couldn't control. When he finished installing the last cabinet, he turned to me, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's it," he said, his voice tinged with finality. "All done." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "It looks great. Mark will be happy." He tilted his head, studying me. "What about you? Are you happy?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I felt a rush of tears threaten to spill, and I quickly turned away. "Laura," he said softly, his voice closer now. "I can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I'm not." But before I could finish, he gently turned me to face him. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, it felt like time stopped. "You don't have to explain," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But you don't have to keep pretending either. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me, or maybe it was him, but suddenly we were inches apart, the air between us thick with unspoken words and unresolved feelings." His hands cupped my face, his thumbs brushing away the tears I didn't realize had fallen. "David," I murmured, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and longing. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice low and earnest. "If you don't want this, just tell me, and I'll stop." I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell him to stop because in that moment, I didn't want him to. I wanted to feel something, anything, that wasn't the crushing weight of loneliness and regret. So instead of pushing him away, I closed the gap between us, my lips meeting his in a kiss that felt like a lifeline. This kiss wasn't hesitant or tentative like the first. It was desperate, urgent, a collision of emotions we could no longer contain. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, letting the world fall away. Time seemed to blur after that. One moment we were in the kitchen, and the next we were in the living room, our movements guided by pure instinct. He laid me down on the couch, his hands roaming over me, with a mix of reverence and hunger, as though he was discovering something sacred. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice husky and filled with restraint. I nodded, my breath hitching. "Yes." And just like that, the floodgates opened. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word was a release of everything we'd been holding back. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, raw, and overwhelming. For the first time in years, I felt alive, seen, and deeply, irrevocably desired. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the couch, the room bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. My head rested on his chest, rising and falling with the rhythm of his breathing. Neither of us spoke, the silence filled with the weight of what we'd just done. "I shouldn't have let this happen," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. David tightened his arms around me, his lips brushing against my hair. "I don't regret it," he said simply. I wanted to believe him, but the guilt was already creeping in, dark and relentless. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me as I avoided his gaze. This can't happen again." "Look, no," I said firmly, cutting him off. "We can't. I can't." He sat up too, his expression conflicted. "I know this is complicated, but what we have, it's real. You can't deny that." He nodded. "I'm married," I said, my voice cracking. "I can't just throw that away." David looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and understanding. "You don't have to make any decisions right now," he said gently, "but don't shut this down just because it's easier." I didn't respond. Instead, I stood, gathering my clothes as I tried to steady the storm inside me. "You should go," I said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "Lauren, please," I said, my voice trembling. "Just go." When the door finally closed behind him, I sank to the floor, burying my face in my hands. The house felt unbearably quiet, the echoes of what had just happened reverberating in my mind. I knew I couldn't undo it, couldn't take it back, but I also couldn't ignore the way it had made me feel. For the first time in years, I felt alive. But at what cost? As Laura wrestles with the fallout of her actions, Mark's early return threatens to unravel the fragile balance she's trying to maintain. Will she confront the truth about her marriage, or will the weight of her choices lead her to make an even riskier decision? The following days were a blur of guilt, longing, and confusion. I couldn't stop replaying the moments with David in my mind, the way his hands had felt on me, the way he had looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. It was intoxicating and maddening all at once, and I hated myself for wanting more. So all of this started out bad. Mark called sporadically, his usual detached tone grating against my already fragile nerves. "I'll be home Friday," he said in one of his calls, his voice muffled as though he were distracted. "You didn't forget to send the photos of the kitchen, right?" "No, I haven't taken them yet," I replied, my voice clipped. "Well, don't forget," he said dismissively. "I've got to go. Meeting's starting. See you soon." And just like that, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my chest tightening with resentment. "See you soon," he'd said, as if his absence didn't matter, as if my life was on pause until he decided to step back into it. The anger bubbled up, mixing with the guilt and the longing until I felt like I might explode. On Thursday evening, I found myself pacing the living room, the weight of Mark's impending return pressing down on me. I hadn't seen David since that day, and part of me was relieved. Another part of me ached for him, for the comfort and passion he'd awakened in me. As if on cue, a knock echoed through the house. My heart leapt into my throat. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. When I opened it, there he was, David, standing on the porch with that same quiet confidence that had drawn me to him in the first place. "Hey," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't stop thinking about you." I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening on the edge of the door. "David, this isn't a good idea." "Maybe not," he admitted, stepping closer. "But that doesn't mean it's not the right one." His words hit me like a jolt, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. I stepped back, letting him inside, even though I knew it was the worst thing I could do. We sat on the couch, the silence between us heavy with unspoken emotions. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked at me with a mix of longing and frustration. "Why are you fighting this?" he asked, his voice raw. "You can't tell me you didn't feel it too." "Of course I felt it," I snapped, my emotions spilling over. "But feeling something doesn't make it right." David leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe not, but it doesn't make it wrong either." I shook my head, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "I can't just throw my marriage away." "Is it even a marriage anymore?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. "When was the last time Mark made you feel the way you felt the other day? The way you feel now?" His words cut deep because I couldn't answer. I couldn't remember the last time Mark had looked at me the way David did, or made me feel like I mattered. But admitting that felt like betrayal, even more than what I'd already done. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. David reached for my hand, his touch steady and grounding. "You deserve more than this, Laura, more than just existing." That night, I told David to leave. Not because I wanted him to, but because I needed him to. The ache in my chest as I closed the door behind him was almost unbearable, but I knew it was the only way to keep my world from completely falling apart, or so I thought. The next morning, Mark arrived home earlier than expected. I was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and trying to push the memories of David out of my mind, when I heard the unmistakable sound of his suitcase wheels rolling across the floor. "Laura," he called, his voice echoing through the house. "In here," I replied, setting my mug down and forcing a smile as he walked into the room. He looked tired, his suit slightly wrinkled, but there was no warmth in his expression. He kissed me on the cheek, a brief, perfunctory gesture that felt more like an obligation than affection. "Kitchen looks good," he said, glancing around. "David finished everything?" I nodded, my stomach twisting. "Yeah, it's all done." Mark didn't notice my hesitation, or if he did, he didn't care. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails as he spoke. "I've got a few things to catch up on, but maybe we can do dinner tonight. It's been a while." His words were casual, almost off-handed, but they struck a nerve. Was this his version of making an effort? A half-hearted offer of dinner after weeks of neglect? "Sure," I said, my voice tight. "Dinner sounds great." As the day went on, I tried to fall back into the routine of our life together, but everything felt different now. The walls of the house seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with the weight of my secrets. By the time dinner rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves, Mark seemed oblivious, his focus on his phone as we ate. The conversation was minimal. Updates about work, a brief mention of his trip, and I found myself growing more and more restless. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I set my fork down, my hands trembling as I looked at him. "Mark, can we talk?" He glanced up, his brow furrowing. "About what?" "About us," I said, my voice wavering. "About what's been happening between us, or what hasn't been happening." Mark sighed, setting his phone aside. "Laura, I know I've been busy, but I'm doing it for us, for our future." He paused. "Our future?" I repeated, my frustration bubbling over. "Mark, you've been so focused on the future that you've completely forgotten about the present. About me." He frowned, his posture stiffening. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I shot back. "When was the last time you really saw me, Mark? When was the last time you cared about what I was feeling?" Mark's silence was deafening, and I felt the tears start to spill again. "I can't keep living like this," I said, my voice breaking. "I need more. I need to feel like I matter." His expression softened, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "Laura, But before he could finish, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen, and my heart stopped. It was a message from David. As Laura's world teeters on the edge of unraveling, the message from David forces her to confront the choices she's made and the life she truly wants. Will she find the strength to break free, or will the weight of her decisions pull her under? The message from David sat on my phone screen like a ticking time bomb. My breath caught as I stared at it, my hand frozen mid-reach. The words were simple, innocent even. But the weight they carried was anything but. "Can we talk?" "Who is it?" Mark asked, his tone casual, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "Just a notification," I lied, quickly flipping the phone over. "Nothing important." Mark nodded and returned to his dinner, unaware of how my heart was pounding in my chest. I could barely taste the food in front of me. Every bite felt like it might choke me. I excused myself as soon as I could, retreating to the bathroom where I could finally breathe. Leaning against the sink, I unlocked my phone and reread David's message. My thumb hovered over the screen as I debated what to do. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to bury the temptation and pretend that nothing had happened. But another part, the part that felt alive for the first time in years, couldn't resist. My fingers moved almost on their own as I typed a reply. "Now isn't a good time. I'll call you tomorrow." The moment I hit send, I felt a pang of regret. What was I doing? I couldn't keep dragging this out, couldn't keep balancing on this razor-thin edge between my past and whatever it was that David represented. But even as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. The next day, Mark was out early for a meeting. As soon as the door closed behind him, I let out a shaky breath and picked up my phone. David's reply was already waiting. "I'll be at the park near your house at noon. If you want to talk, come find me." I knew I shouldn't go. I knew I should delete the message, block his number, and focus on rebuilding the fragile pieces of my marriage. But as the hours ticked by, my resolve crumbled. By the time noon rolled around, I found myself slipping on my coat and heading out the door. The park was quiet, the crisp autumn air filled with the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. David was sitting on a bench near the lake, his head bowed as he scrolled through his phone. He looked up as I approached, his face lighting up with a soft, almost hesitant smile. "Hey," he said, standing as I reached him. I wasn't sure if you'd come. I wasn't sure either, I admitted, crossing my arms against the chill. But here I am. He motioned for me to sit, and we settled onto the bench together, the space between us both comforting and suffocating. I wanted to check on you, he said after a moment, his voice low. After everything. I'm fine, I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. It's complicated, but I'm handling it. David nodded, his brow furrowing as he looked out over the lake. I don't want to make things harder for you, Laura. I can't stop thinking about you. The raw honesty in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. David, this isn't fair. To you, to me, or to Mark. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. You don't have to know, he said, turning to face me. But don't shut this out just because it's messy. Sometimes the messy things are the ones worth figuring out. I bit my lip, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. I can't hurt him like this. Even if things aren't perfect, I can't just walk away. David reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now. I just needed you to know that I'm here, for whatever you need. Seeing my face, he moved toward me. The words hung in the air, and for a moment I let myself believe them. I let myself imagine a world where I didn't have to choose, where I could hold on to the pieces of myself that David had awakened, without destroying everything else in the process. But reality came crashing back all too quickly. I should go, I said, pulling my hand away. Mark will be home soon. David nodded, though the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. Take care of yourself, Laura. I stood, my heart heavy as I walked away. But as I turned the corner and his figure disappeared from view, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left a part of myself behind. When I got home, Mark was already back, his briefcase sitting by the door. He looked up from his laptop as I walked in, his brow furrowing slightly. Where were you? He asked, his tone neutral but tinged with curiosity. Went for a walk, I replied, slipping off my coat. Needed some air. He nodded and returned to his screen, the conversation already forgotten. But as I stood there, watching him work, I realized just how wide the gulf between us had grown, and I didn't know if it could ever be bridged. That night, as Mark slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I knew without looking who it was. I miss you. David's words were simple, but they carried an impossible weight. My fingers hovered over the screen as I debated how to respond. But before I could decide, Mark stirred beside me, his arm draping lazily across my waist. It was a gesture that once would have made me feel safe, cherished. Now it felt like a chain, binding me to a life I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. I set the phone back down, the message unanswered. But as I closed my eyes, I knew the silence wouldn't last forever. As I lay back, my mind was racing, my heart was pounding. With Laura's emotions pulling her in two directions, the stakes grow higher as Mark begins to sense her distance. Meanwhile, David becomes increasingly persistent, forcing Laura to confront the truth about what she truly wants. Will she stay and try to repair her marriage, or will her heart lead her down an irrevocable path? The days following my meeting with David were agonizing. I felt like I was living two separate lives. One where I was Mark's dutiful wife, going through the motions of our day-to-day routine, and another where my thoughts were consumed by David. I could still feel his hand on mine, the sincerity in his voice as he told me he was there for me. It was intoxicating, but it was also tearing me apart. Mark, for his part, seemed oblivious. Or maybe he simply didn't care. He spent his evenings buried in emails or half watching TV with his phone glued to his hand. The disconnect between us was palpable, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more suffocating it became. One evening, as I was clearing the dinner table, Mark spoke up unexpectedly. "You've been quiet lately," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Everything okay?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I froze, unsure how to respond. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Mark nodded, accepting my answer without pressing further, but the weight of his apathy settled heavy on my chest. How had we gotten here, to this place where even the simplest questions felt rehearsed and meaningless? As I stood at the sink, scrubbing the same plate over and over, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I didn't have to look to know who it was. My heart raced as I dried my hands and pulled it out. "I need to see you." David's message was simple, but it was enough to send my mind spiraling. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Every part of me knew I should ignore him, delete the message, and try to salvage what was left of my marriage. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong. The next afternoon, I found myself back at the park. David was waiting for me at the same bench, his posture tense and his eyes searching the path until they landed on me. He stood as I approached, his face softening into a smile that made my chest tighten. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice warm but laced with urgency. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The air between us crackled with unspoken words, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Finally, David broke the silence. "I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way," he said, his voice low and steady. "About you, about us." "Said David," I began, my voice trembling. We can't." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "I know it's complicated, and I know you're trying to do the right thing. But you don't have to go through this alone. You deserve more than this, more than just surviving." His words struck a chord deep within me, and tears welled up in my eyes. "It's not that simple," I whispered. "I've built my whole life around Mark. I don't know how to walk away from that." David reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now," he said softly. "But I need you to know that I'm here, no matter what." I nodded, unable to speak. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. All I knew was that being around David made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years, but at what cost? As I walked back home, my thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt, longing, and confusion. Mark's car was already in the driveway when I arrived, and my stomach twisted with a mix of relief and dread. I needed to face this, to face him, but I didn't know where to start. When I walked inside, Mark was in the living room, flipping through the mail. He glanced up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said casually. "Where were you?" "Out for a walk," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Mark nodded and returned to the mail, but something about his demeanor felt different. He seemed quieter, more reserved, and it put me on edge. Our evening. After dinner, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, Mark finally broke the silence. "Are you happy, Laura?" he asked, his voice startlingly soft. The question caught me off guard, and I turned to look at him, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" I mean us, he said, his gaze fixed on the coffee table. Are you happy with us? The vulnerability in his voice was unexpected, and it made my chest ache. Mark, He looked up, his eyes searching mine. You've been distant lately. I thought it was just work stress, but now I'm not so sure. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I feel like we've been living separate lives for so long. I don't know how to fix it. Mark's expression softened, and for the first time in months I saw a flicker of the man I had married. I don't want to lose you, Laura, he said, his voice thick with emotion. If we've drifted apart, I want to find a way back. The sincerity in his words cut through me, and I felt tears streaming down my face. I don't know if we can, I said, my voice trembling. I don't know if I can. Mark reached for my hand, his touch hesitant but firm. Let's try, he said. Please. That night, as Mark slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His words echoed in my mind, mingling with David's. Both men were offering me something. Security, passion, love, but I couldn't reconcile the two. I was at a crossroads, and no matter which path I chose, someone would get hurt. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and my heart sank as I read the message. I'm leaving town tomorrow. If you want to see me, tonight's your chance. The choice was clear, but it wasn't easy. I sat there, the weight of my decision pressing down on me, knowing that whatever I chose, my life would never be the same. As Laura grapples with the most critical decision of her life, the line between her past and her potential future becomes razor thin. Will she fight to rebuild her marriage with Mark, or will she risk everything for one final moment with David? The message from David sat on my phone screen like an accusation, as if every unspoken truth and hidden desire were laid bare in those few words. I'm leaving town tomorrow. If you want to see me, tonight's your chance. I stared at the glowing text, my heart hammering in my chest. This was it, the moment that could change everything or end it. I glanced over at Mark, asleep beside me, his face slack and peaceful in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. For the first time in years, he had said he wanted to try, wanted to fix what was broken between us. But was it too little, too late? My hands trembled as I set the phone back down. I tried to convince myself that the right choice was to stay, to close my eyes and let the night pass in silence. But my mind was racing, the weight of my indecision suffocating me. I couldn't escape the thought that if I didn't see David tonight, I would always wonder what it would have felt like to follow my heart instead of my fears. The clock on the nightstand ticked on, each second amplifying the pressure until I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped out of bed, moving as silently as I could, and grabbed my coat from the closet. The house felt oppressive, every creak of the floorboards a reminder of the betrayal I was about to commit, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The park was empty, shrouded in the quiet stillness of the night. The streetlights cast long shadows over the paths, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. David was waiting on the same bench as before, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his shoulders hunched against the cold. When he saw me, he stood, his face lighting up with a mixture of relief and something deeper, something that made my knees weak. "You came," he said, his voice soft but filled with meaning. I shouldn't have. I replied, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. David stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. But you did. For a moment we stood there in silence, the distance between us shrinking until it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of us. I felt his hand brush against mine, tentative and questioning, and my breath caught. "Ting. Alora," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "Tell me this isn't real. Tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll walk away. I'll leave tonight and never look back." I couldn't say it. I couldn't lie, not to him and not to myself. Instead, I closed the gap between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was equal parts desperation and longing. The world seemed to tilt as his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't invisible. We didn't go far. David led me to his truck, parked just beyond the edge of the park, and we sat there in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, talking about everything and nothing. It was like peeling back layers of myself I had forgotten existed, rediscovering pieces that had been buried under years of monotony and neglect. "Why me?" I asked at one point, my voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. "You could have anyone. Why choose someone like me?" David reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "Because you see me," he said simply, "and I see you." His words hit me like a lightning bolt, shattering the walls I had built around my heart. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I didn't bother wiping them away. For the first time in years, I felt like someone truly understood me, saw the cracks, and chose to stay anyway. The night passed too quickly. Before I knew it, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and reality began to creep back in. I knew I couldn't stay with David, not forever. My life with Mark, broken as it was, still loomed over me like an unfinished chapter I couldn't ignore. "I should go," I said, my voice trembling as I pulled away from his embrace. "Mark will wake up soon." David nodded, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betrayed the sadness he tried to hide. "Will I see you again?" he asked, his voice soft. "I don't know," I admitted, my throat tightening. "I don't know anything anymore." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Whatever happens, I'm glad I met you," he said. "You've changed me, Laura, and I'll never forget that." I nodded, unable to speak, and slipped out of the truck before my resolve could falter. As I walked away, the cold morning air stinging my cheeks, I felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. When I returned home, the house was still quiet. Mark was still asleep, his steady breathing filling the room as I slipped back under the covers. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with everything that had happened. The warmth of David's touch lingered on my skin, but so did the weight of my guilt. Mark stirred beside me, his arm draping over my waist. "Morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "What time is it?" "Late." "Early," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "Go back to sleep." He mumbled something unintelligible and buried his face in the pillow, oblivious to the battle raging in my heart. I closed my eyes, willing myself to feel something, anything, but the numbness was overwhelming. As Laura struggles to reconcile her actions with her marriage, Mark begins to sense that something is wrong. Meanwhile, David's departure leaves a void she can't ignore. Will Laura come clean and face the consequences, or will she continue to live a double life, risking everything in the process? The following days passed in a haze. I went through the motions of my life with Mark, but it all felt hollow, as if I were playing a role in someone else's story. My mind kept drifting back to David, his words, his touch, the way he looked at me like I was someone worth fighting for. His chest hummed, his words singing, my breath. Mark, as always, seemed oblivious. He'd returned to his usual routine of late nights and distracted conversations, and any attempts at reconnecting felt superficial at best. I couldn't tell if he was genuinely trying or if he simply didn't know how to reach me anymore. One evening, as we sat in silence at the dinner table, Mark finally broke the monotony. "We should take a trip," he said, his tone casual but firm. "Just the two of us. Maybe it'll help, reset things." I stared at him, caught off guard. "A trip?" "Yeah," he said, pushing his plate aside. "It's been years since we've gone anywhere together. I thought it might be good for us." The idea sounded nice in theory, but the weight of my guilt made it hard to imagine spending time alone with him, pretending everything was fine. "Where would we even go?" I asked, stalling. "I don't know, somewhere quiet, away from all this," he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "I just want us to figure things out, Laura." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe this was our chance to fix what was broken, to find a way back to each other. But then I thought of David, of the way he made me feel, and the hope quickly gave way to despair. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice flat. Mark nodded, but the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. He didn't press the issue, and the silence that followed was suffocating. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Mark slept beside me. His suggestion lingered in my mind, twisting and turning until I couldn't bear it any longer. I slipped out of bed, grabbing my phone as I made my way to the living room. David's number was still saved in my contacts, and my finger hovered over it for what felt like an eternity. I knew I shouldn't call him, that it would only make things more complicated, but the pull was too strong. Before I could talk myself out of it, I pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but warm. "Laura?" "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I shouldn't have called." "It's okay," he said, his tone soft and reassuring. "What's going on?" I hesitated, unsure of how to put my feelings into words. "I don't know what to do," I admitted finally. "Mark wants to take a trip, to try to fix things, but I don't even know if it's worth it anymore." David was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. "Do you want to fix things?" he asked gently. "I don't know," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "I feel so lost, David. I don't know what I want anymore." He sighed, and I could hear the sadness in his voice. "I can't tell you what to do, Laura, but I can tell you this. You deserve to be happy, whatever that means, whatever it looks like. You deserve it." His words hung in the air, and for a moment I felt a glimmer of clarity. But it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of my guilt and the uncertainty of the future. "I should go," I said, my voice shaky. "Laura," he said, his tone urgent, "whatever you decide, just know that I'm here for you. Always." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and ended the call. As I sat in the darkness, the tears finally spilled over, and I felt the full weight of my choices pressing down on me. The next morning, Mark brought up the trip again over breakfast. "I was thinking we could go to the cabin," he said, his tone cautious. "It's quiet, and it'll give us a chance to really talk. The cabin. It had been years since we'd been there, and the thought of revisiting a place that once held so many happy memories made my chest ache. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's do it." Mark's face lit up with relief, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt for how detached I'd been. Maybe this was the right thing to do. Maybe this was our chance to find our way back to each other. The drive to the cabin was quiet, but not in an uncomfortable way. Mark seemed relaxed, as if he believed this trip would be the solution to all our problems. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. When we arrived, the cabin was just as I remembered it, nestled among the trees, with a view of the lake that stretched out endlessly. It was beautiful, peaceful, and almost suffocating in its familiarity. Mark unpacked the car while I wandered down to the dock, the sound of the water lapping against the shore soothing my frayed nerves. As I stood there, staring out at the horizon, I felt a strange mix of hope and dread. This trip could change everything, or it could confirm what I already feared. That evening, as we sat by the fire, Mark finally broached the topic that had been hanging between us for weeks. "I know things haven't been great," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "And I know a lot of that is my fault." I looked at him, surprised by his candor. "Mark, let me finish," he said, holding up a hand. "I've been so focused on work, on providing for us, that I lost sight of what really matters. I lost sight of you. And I'm sorry, Laura. I really am." His words brought tears to my eyes, and for the first time in years I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had once made me feel like the center of his world. My eyes closed. "I want to fix this," he said, his voice breaking. "But I need to know if you want that too, because I can't do it alone." I stared at him, my heart pounding. The truth was, I didn't know if I wanted to fix things. I didn't know if we could ever go back to the way we were. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw the sincerity there, and it made me question everything. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice trembling, "but I want to try." Mark nodded, his relief palpable. "That's all I need," he said, "just a chance." As we sat there, the fire crackling between us, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was our fresh start. Maybe we could find a way to rebuild what we had lost. But deep down, I knew the shadows of my choices would follow me, no matter where this path led. As Laura and Mark begin their journey toward reconciliation, the ghosts of her connection with David threaten to resurface. Will she fully commit to repairing her marriage, or will her lingering feelings for David unravel her fragile resolve? The next morning at the cabin felt like a fresh start. The air was crisp, and the light filtering through the trees carried a quiet serenity. For the first time in a long time, Mark and I shared a moment that felt almost normal. He brewed coffee while I sat on the porch, watching the mist rise off the lake. It was peaceful, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe we could find our way back to each other. "Beautiful morning," Mark said, handing me a steaming mug and sitting beside me. His smile was small but genuine, a glimpse of the man I used to know. "It is," I replied, my voice soft. I sipped the coffee, savoring the warmth as I watched the sun climb higher over the trees. "We could take the canoe out later," he suggested, "like we used to." I nodded, a flicker of nostalgia warming my chest. I'd like that. It was a simple exchange, but it felt significant. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a spark of connection between us. But even as I tried to hold on to that hope, the shadow of David loomed in the back of my mind. As the day unfolded, we settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. We paddled out onto the lake, the still water reflecting the trees and sky like a mirror. Mark seemed lighter, more present, and for a while I let myself enjoy the ease of it. "Remember that time the canoe tipped over?" he asked, a laugh escaping him as he maneuvered us across the water. I smiled, the memory surfacing like a long-lost treasure. "You insisted it was my fault, even though you were the one who leaned too far." "I was trying to catch the fish," he said, feigning indignation. "You were supposed to balance us." "You were flailing like a maniac," I countered, laughing. It was the first genuine laugh we'd shared in years, and for a moment the weight of everything else faded. We drifted in the canoe, the silence between us no longer heavy but comfortable. "I miss this," Mark said finally, his voice low. "I miss us." I looked at him, his expression sincere, and my chest tightened. "I do too," I admitted, though the words felt bittersweet. I moved my fingers to his face. That evening, as we sat by the fire again, Mark brought out a bottle of wine. We talked about old times, about the early years of our marriage, when everything felt simple and full of promise. The warmth of the wine loosened the tension between us, and for the first time in a long time, I felt myself letting go of the walls I'd built around my heart. "I know I haven't been the best husband," Mark said, his tone serious but not heavy. "I've let work take over, and I didn't realize how much I was losing until it felt like it was too late." His honesty caught me off guard, and I felt a pang of guilt. "We both let things slip," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I don't want to lose you, Laura. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I squeezed his hand. "I don't want to lose you either," I said, my voice trembling. And in that moment, I meant it. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, I felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. I wanted to believe that we could rebuild what we had lost, but I couldn't ignore the lingering presence of David in my thoughts. His voice, his touch, the way he made me feel. It was all still there, refusing to fade. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and my heart sank. I knew it was him before I even looked at the screen. "Thinking of you, I hope you're okay." The message was simple, but it unraveled me. I stared at the words, my mind racing. I had told David that I needed space, that I was going to try to fix things with Mark. But seeing his name on my screen sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I set the phone face down, trying to push the thoughts away. But sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it finally did, my dreams were a confusing tangle of past and present, of Mark and David, of choices I didn't know how to make. The next day, the tension I thought we had eased returned with a vengeance. Mark had gone into town for supplies, leaving me alone at the cabin. I sat on the porch, staring out at the lake. My thoughts, a chaotic mess. David's message lingered in my mind, and despite my better judgment, I picked up my phone. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard before I finally typed a response. "I'm okay. Trying to figure things out." I hit send before I could change my mind, and almost immediately the phone buzzed with his reply. "I'm here if you need me." The words were comforting and devastating all at once. I knew I couldn't keep walking this line, couldn't keep holding onto both men without tearing myself apart. But the thought of letting go, of choosing one path and closing the door on the other, felt impossible. When Mark returned, he seemed in good spirits, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. He brought back groceries and a bouquet of wild flowers he'd picked along the way. "For you," he said, handing them to me with a sheepish smile. "Figured, it's been a while since I brought you flowers." I took them, my throat tightening. "Thank you," I said softly, my fingers brushing his as I accepted the bouquet. Mark leaned down, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "I love you, Laura. I know I don't say it enough, but I do." His words pierced through me, and I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "I love you too," I said, though the words felt fragile, like they might shatter under the weight of everything I wasn't saying. As Laura continues to navigate the fragile balance between her rekindled connection with Mark and her unresolved feelings for David, she faces an unexpected revelation that threatens to unravel everything. Will she find the courage to make a choice, or will the weight of her indecision destroy the life she's trying to rebuild?